The transcript was 3 pages long, and Ambassador Vale Dorith had read it 4 times. Not because it was complicated, because something in it refused to make sense. The human delegation had agreed, all of it, every clause, every condition, every demand. The conclave had spent 11 months negotiating. They had signed without counter-proposals, without amendments, without the tortured back and forth that every species in the Galactic Conclave had warned was characteristic of human diplomacy. The lead negotiator, a woman named Marin Solis, had read the final document once, looked up at the assembled chamber and said 7 words. "We understand what you're asking us to do." Then she signed. That was 4 months ago, and Vale Dorith had not slept well since. He didn't know why. The disarmament accord was a triumph by every measurable standard. Humanity's military capability, which had grown at a rate that alarmed every intelligence body in the conclave, was to be reduced by 92% over 18 months. Weapons platforms decommissioned, warships dismantled or repurposed, ground forces demobilized. The full technical specifications of their most advanced weapon systems handed over for destruction verification. It was, by any reasonable analysis, the most successful non-violent containment of an emerging species in conclave history. So why, Vale Dorith kept asking himself, did Marin Solis look relieved? Her name was Kale, short for something longer that she'd stopped using when she was 19 and didn't explain to people she'd known for less than a decade. She was 34 years old, formerly a systems integration specialist aboard the ECV Harrogate, currently unemployed in the technical sense because the Harrogate had been one of the 41 vessels selected for decommissioning in the first wave. She was also, as of 6 weeks ago, one of approximately 800 humans embedded in the Conclave Civilian Observation Program, a goodwill initiative the Conclave had proposed, and the human government had accepted with what observers described as suspicious enthusiasm. The program placed human civilians aboard Conclave vessels, stations, and administrative facilities for a period of 12 to 18 months. The stated purpose was cultural exchange and transparency. The Conclave's actual purpose, which they did not state but also did not particularly hide, was monitoring. They wanted to know what humans did when they were unarmed and far from home, and surrounded by species that had just stripped them of the tools they'd spent 2 centuries building. What they expected: resentment, withdrawal, possible signs of psychological deterioration. What Kale gave them on her first morning, aboard Conclave Station, Meridian 7. A cup of something she'd synthesized from available ingredients that smelled like coffee. A request for access to the maintenance sublevels, because she'd noticed an inefficiency in the atmospheric recycling loop that the station engineers might not be aware of, and a question about whether the Conclave's standard recreation protocols included anything involving physical exertion, because she found it hard to think clearly without it. The station administrator, a Voreth named Eseth Ka, processed this sequence of requests and filed a notation in her daily report. Human subject displays orientation toward productivity despite presumed emotional distress. Motivation unclear. Eseth Ka did not know that Kale had spent her first night aboard the station sitting on the floor of her assigned quarters with her back against the wall, not sleeping, counting the sounds of a station she didn't know yet, cataloging which ones were normal and which ones weren't. She didn't know that Kale had located every emergency exit on her residential level within the first 2 hours. She didn't know about the notebook, actual paper, which Kale had brought in her personal allowance, or what was written in it. Nobody knew about the notebook. Vale Dorith's unease had a specific shape by the time he requested the secondary analysis. The initial behavioral assessments of the embedded human civilians had been filed, cataloged, and summarized into a 30-page overview that concluded, adjustment proceeding within expected parameters. No indicators of organized resistance. He had read this document and immediately requested the raw reports from which it had been synthesized, not because he distrusted the analysts, because something in the summary felt like a photograph taken from too far away. The raw reports were 712 pages. He read them over 3 days, and on the 4th day he called his assistant into his office and told her to cancel everything for the week, because the humans weren't adjusting, not in the way the summary implied. They were doing something else, something the analysts had observed, described accurately, and then fundamentally mischaracterized. Dozens of embedded humans across 14 different facilities were doing things that made perfect individual sense and made no collective sense whatsoever. One human was reorganizing a conclave archival database using a classification system he'd apparently invented. Another had befriended a Vorath maintenance crew and was teaching them a card game with rules that seemed to shift depending on who was losing. Another had requested and received permission to conduct what she described as informal surveys of station residents regarding their daily emotional states, which she was recording in a document she called, with no apparent irony, the Mood Project. Individually, harmless eccentrics. Collectively, Vale Dorith didn't have the word for it yet. It felt like something he'd once read about in xenoarchaeological literature, the way certain organisms, when placed in a new environment, don't simply survive. They begin, immediately and without apparent coordination, to understand it. He pulled Kale's file specifically because it had been flagged, not for anything alarming, for something the flagging analyst had described as unusual competency clustering. In 6 weeks, Kale had identified 4 infrastructure inefficiencies on Meridian 7, 2 of which the station's own engineering team had been unaware of. She had done this, the analyst noted, while appearing to be engaged in ordinary observation and conversation. She had not requested access to restricted systems. She had not exceeded her civilian clearance in any documented way. Vale Dorith stared at the phrase "in any documented way" for a long time. Then he pulled up her original personnel file from the human military records, the ones that had been handed over as part of the Accord's transparency provisions, and found that Marin Solis, in her role as lead negotiator, had personally reviewed and approved Kale's inclusion in the observation program. He didn't know what that meant. He was beginning to suspect it meant something. Kale noticed the administrator watching her more carefully after the 3rd week. Eseth Ka was a professional subtle by Vorath standards, which was not subtle by human standards, but Kale wasn't going to volunteer that information. She noted the increase in monitoring and continued doing exactly what she'd been doing, because stopping would be more conspicuous than continuing, and because she genuinely found the work interesting. The atmospheric recycling inefficiency had been a real inefficiency. She hadn't manufactured it. She'd seen it because she was someone who looked at systems, all systems, everywhere she went and saw the shapes of how they could fail. It was a thing she'd done since she was a child, and her father, an engineer on the Martian Water Reclamation Network, had taught her that every system is a story about its builder's assumptions, and the gaps in any story are where you find the truth. She was finding a great deal of truth on Meridian 7, not military truth. Not anything she'd been sent to find. She'd been sent officially, because she was unemployed and the program offered a stipend and a role, and unofficially because she was exactly the kind of person who had been asked to come, by people she trusted, for reasons that had been explained to her in a conversation she'd had with Marin Solis the night before the signing. A conversation that had lasted 4 hours. A conversation after which Kale had cried briefly in a bathroom and then washed her face and agreed. She was finding truth about how the conclave worked, how decisions moved through it, what it valued and what it feared. She was finding it in the maintenance logs she'd been granted access to for legitimate reasons, in the scheduling patterns of administrative meetings, in the way conclave personnel talked to each other when they thought humans were out of earshot but hadn't yet recalibrated for human hearing ranges. She wrote it all in the notebook. Not reports, not intelligence. The notebook wasn't that. The notebook was something she'd promised Marin she would keep because Marin had said on that last night, "Don't try to understand everything at once. Just write down what you see. We'll figure out what it means later, all of us together." And Kale had said, "How many of us are there?" And Marin had said, very quietly enough, 800 humans in the program. Kale had now made contact, carefully, indirectly, with 19 of them. Not through any network the Conclave could trace, through the oldest possible method. Letters, actual written correspondence, routed through the Conclave's own civilian mail system, which was not monitored because it had never needed to be monitored, because no species in the Conclave communicated by handwriting things on paper and mailing them across interstellar space. It was slow. It was inefficient. It was invisible. The second thing Vale Dorith noticed, the thing that moved his unease from the background of his thinking to the foreground, was the decommissioning irregularity. It was small. A timing discrepancy in the dismantling schedule for the ECV Harrogate's secondary weapons array. The human engineering team assigned to the decommissioning had documented every step with impeccable transparency. They had invited conclave verification teams to observe. They had been cooperative, professional, and thorough. They had also taken 11% longer than projected on a specific subsystem that, according to the technical specifications humans had provided, should have been straightforward to dismantle. 11% was within acceptable variance. The verification team had logged it as such. Vale Dorith requested the raw footage from the verification team's recording equipment. It took him a long time to understand what he was looking at, because he didn't have the engineering background to recognize it immediately. He had to bring in a technical analyst, a Droshan engineer named Quelvarek, one of the best weapons systems specialists in the Conclave's employ, and ask her to review the footage without context. Quelvarek watched 40 minutes of footage and then sat in silence for a while. They weren't dismantling it, she finally said. Vale Dorith waited. I mean, they were. Everything they removed was removed, but the sequence. She pulled up a holographic display and began annotating. A standard disassembly follows the integration architecture. You remove components in the reverse order of installation. It's efficient. It's logical. Any competent engineer does it automatically. She highlighted several segments of the footage. They didn't do that. They removed things in an order that made the process harder, slower, and more technically demanding. They created additional work for themselves. Why would they do that? That's what I'm trying to determine. She stared at the display. The only reason I can identify, and I want to be clear that this is speculative, is that their sequence preserved something, some configuration or relationship between components that standard disassembly would have destroyed. She paused. But they destroyed the components. I verified that independently. Every piece is gone. So what they preserved, I cannot tell you. The knowledge, Vale Dorith said. Quelvarek looked at him. The knowledge of how to reassemble it, he said. They were memorizing the process in reverse so they would know how to rebuild it. The silence that followed was the kind that changes the shape of a room. That's, Quelvarek said and stopped. You can't verify that. No, he agreed. I can't. He pulled the decommissioning schedules for 17 other vessels. He requested Quelvarek's assessment on sequence analysis for all of them. She came back to him 5 days later, and the expression on her face was one he had never seen on a Droshan before, a species not known for displays of uncertainty. 12 of the 17, she said. The other 5 I can't determine conclusively. 12 vessels. Human engineers, during the act of complying with a disarmament accord, had potentially encoded the entire reassembly sequence into the pattern of their compliance. And the Conclave had watched every minute of it, documented every step, and verified it as legitimate. Vale Dorith went back to the transcript of the signing ceremony and read the 7 words again. We understand what you're asking us to do. Not, we agree. Not, we accept your terms. We understand what you're asking. Kale received her 19th letter on a Tuesday, which didn't mean anything on Meridian 7, but which she still tracked because she'd been doing it since she was a child and time felt more real when you divided it into pieces with names. The letter was from a man named Dav, formerly a structural engineer aboard the ECV Tennyson, currently embedded on a conclave agricultural research station in the Quelith system. He'd been there for 4 months. His letter was 14 pages long, written in the dense shorthand they developed. Not a code, exactly, more like a shared vocabulary that had emerged naturally across the correspondence. A compression of meaning that looked, to anyone who might intercept and read it, like the enthusiastic letter of an engineer with too much time and too many technical observations. Dov had found something. He had found it by accident, the way he always found things, by being the kind of person who couldn't look at a structure without wanting to understand how it bore weight. The agricultural station had a water distribution network that was, by any assessment, functional. It was also, by Dov's assessment, built on an assumption that he kept returning to in his letter. They built it as if the thing it was distributing would always behave the same way. He meant the water, but he didn't mean the water. Kale read that section 4 times before she understood what he'd actually found. The conclave's infrastructure, across every installation she'd been able to observe or receive reports on, was built on an assumption of consistency. That resources behaved predictably. That systems operated within expected parameters. That variance was an error to be corrected rather than a condition to be survived. It was engineering philosophy, and it was elegant, and it was the philosophy of a civilization that had never had to adapt to scarcity the way humanity had. The conclave had spread through a galaxy of abundance. They built for the world as it was. Humanity had built, for most of its history, for the world as it could become. The worst version. The version where everything went wrong at once and you had to keep going anyway. She wrote this in the notebook. She wrote it slowly because it was important to get right. Then she wrote, "What happens when a civilization built for consistency meets a problem that isn't consistent?" She underlined it. She left space beneath it. She thought about Marin Solis, who had looked relieved at the signing. She thought she was starting to understand why. The crisis came from a direction nobody had predicted, which was itself a lesson that nobody in the conclave had the context to receive. The shriek, the human scientific community's inelegant but accurate name for the phenomenon, was a catastrophic resonance cascade originating from the Quelith system's primary stellar mass, a low-frequency electromagnetic pulse pattern that propagated through normal space at a rate that defied the conclave's predictive models. They had known about resonance cascades theoretically. They had never observed one at this scale. They had 37 hours of warning. In 37 hours, the cascade would reach 14 inhabited conclave systems. Not destroy them, not directly, but every piece of technology above a certain complexity threshold, running on the standard harmonic architecture that the conclave had refined and standardized over 400 years, would fail. The disruption would last between 6 and 9 months. The agricultural, medical, and logistical systems of 14 systems, containing approximately 60 billion people, would go dark. The conclave's emergency response council convened within the hour. They had protocols. They had plans. They had resources, and they began deploying them immediately with the efficiency of a civilization that had practiced crisis management for centuries. What they did not have, what they discovered in the third hour of the emergency session, that they did not have, was any system capable of operating through a resonance cascade of this magnitude. Every backup, every redundancy, every fail-safe architecture in the conclave ran on variations of the same fundamental harmonic standard, because it was the best, because it had been the best for 400 years, because there had been no reason to maintain older, less efficient systems alongside it. The silence in the Emergency Response Council chamber had a quality that Vale Dorith, who was present, would later describe as the silence of a certainty dying. He thought of Quell Varick's face. He thought of the decommissioning footage. He thought of 7 words. He left the chamber and calmed Meridian 7. Esithka found Kale in the sub-level maintenance corridor, where she'd been spending increasing amounts of time, sitting cross-legged on the floor with her notebook open, looking at a junction box with the expression Esithka had come to associate with Kale about to say something that would take 3 hours to implement and would turn out to have been correct. "Ambassador Vale Dorith wants to speak with you," Esithka said. Immediately, Kale looked up. Something moved across her face, not surprise, Esithka noted. Something more complicated, something almost like having waited for this. "Okay," Kale said. She closed the notebook and stood. "Can I ask what it's about?" "There's an emergency." "I know," Kale said. "I've known for about 6 hours. The station's harmonic regulators have been showing micro fluctuations since this morning. I've been trying to figure out if there was a conclave alert I wasn't cleared to receive, or if I was just reading the equipment correctly. HFY stared at her. You detected the precursor signature from maintenance equipment. It's a good junction box, Kale said. Then, how long do we have? Vale Dorith did not ask Kale to explain herself. He asked her one question. What do you need? And Kale, who had spent 4 months on Meridian 7 writing in a notebook, corresponding with 19 people across 14 conclave facilities, cataloging system vulnerabilities and infrastructure philosophies, and the beautiful, terrible consistency of a civilization that had never been forced to build for the worst version of things. Kale looked at the ambassador of the Galactic Conclave and said, I need you to trust that I can't explain everything I'm going to do before I do it. And I need you to understand that where I'm going to start is going to look like I don't know what I'm doing. Why? Because the things that work in a cascade scenario look broken under normal conditions. That's why nobody keeps them. Vale Dorith thought about this. He was a diplomat. He had spent 40 years learning to read the gap between what species said and what they meant. You've been preparing for this, he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was something else, the beginning of an understanding he wasn't sure he wanted to complete. Kale didn't answer immediately. She was looking at her hands, a very human gesture that Vale Dorith had catalogued but never quite understood, that thing humans did when they were locating themselves in their own bodies before saying something true. Not this specifically, she said. We don't predict, we prepare for the category, for systems failing. For the thing you built and relied on not working anymore. Because you've experienced that. Because we've caused it, she said quietly, and survived it, and caused it again. We have a very long history of building things that work perfectly and then losing them and having to figure out what comes next. She paused. We're very good at what comes next. The next 19 hours were the period that conclave historical records would later spend considerable effort trying to accurately describe and consistently fail. The failure was not from lack of documentation. Everything was recorded. The failure was that the documentation, reviewed afterward in sequence, produced an account that violated several assumptions the conclave had held about how problem-solving worked. Kale worked without sleeping. This was not remarkable by human standards. It was remarkable to the Voreth engineers who worked alongside her, because Voreth required 8 hours of metabolic rest per cycle without exception. And watching a human simply continue past the point where continuing should have been biologically possible was disorienting in a way that had nothing to do with technical knowledge. She worked on systems that HFY, watching from the corridor, genuinely could not assess. Not because they were beyond her technical understanding, but because they didn't fit within the framework of what systems were supposed to be. Kale was constructing something from components that were not designed to interface with each other, using methods that quell Varric, who had been emergency patched into the operation as technical verification, described in her log as intuitive architecture that I cannot reverse engineer in real time. She appears to understand what she's building without being able to formally specify it. At hour 11, Kale stopped. She sat down in the middle of the sub-level corridor, pulled out the notebook and wrote for 40 minutes. Nobody interrupted her. HFY, watching on the monitor, could see her writing with the focused, detached expression of someone who was not resting, who was using the pause as a different kind of thinking. At hour 11 and 40 minutes, she stood up, walked to the comm panel and placed a call to Dav on the Quelith Agricultural Station. They spoke for 20 minutes. HFY could not hear the content. The call had been granted privacy clearance as part of the emergency protocols, but she could see Kale's face throughout, and she logged, in her own notes, the following observation. The human does not appear to be asking for information. She appears to be confirming something. She already knows what she needs to know. She is checking that someone else knows it too. At hour 14, Meridian 7's backup life support system, built from components that had no business functioning together, running on operational principles that Varric had classified as technically inadvisable, came online. It ran at 63% efficiency. In the context of what was coming, 63% was the difference between sustainable and unsurvivable. Vale Dorith read the reports from the other facilities as they came in. Dov's agricultural station, water reclamation online using a distribution method he described to the station engineers as the way we did it before we knew better. It was slower. It wasted material. It worked. A human named Priya on a medical station in the Calanthi system had spent 12 hours dismantling and rebuilding a pharmaceutical synthesis unit, using techniques she'd apparently learned from a historical archive she'd requested access to in her second week on station, techniques developed on Earth during a period of industrial collapse 3 centuries ago. The rebuilt unit operated at 48% of normal capacity. The alternative was zero. A human named Marcus, embedded on a deep space relay station, had solved the communications blackout problem not by rebuilding the relay infrastructure, which was impossible in the time available, but by establishing a low-frequency signal network between stations using a method he described to the confused relay engineers as basically shortwave radio. It was ancient. It was limited. It created a web of communication across 14 systems that would survive the cascade because it was too simple to fail. Too simple to fail. Vale Dorith sat with that phrase. The Conclave had spent 4 centuries building toward complexity, toward refinement, toward systems so elegant and efficient that they had forgotten the first principle of survival engineering, which was not efficiency but resilience. Which was not the best possible system, but the system that kept working when everything else stopped. And humanity, which had been developing technology during the same 4 centuries but had never had the luxury of a consistent environment in which to develop it, which had built and lost and rebuilt and lost again, which had experienced enough catastrophe to know that you never fully trust the systems you love most, humanity had remembered. Not by design, by scar tissue. By the specific shape of a species' trauma mapped onto its engineering philosophy. Vale Dorith thought about the decommissioning footage, about the 11% timing discrepancy, about 12 of 17 vessels. They had watched humans comply with the disarmament accord. They had watched every weapon dismantled. They had verified every component destroyed. They had watched humans demonstrate, in painstaking detail, using the process of compliance itself as the medium, exactly how everything worked and exactly how it could be rebuilt. And then they had placed 800 of those humans in conclave facilities across the galaxy, and the humans had spent months doing what humans apparently could not stop themselves from doing. Learning every system they touched, finding where it was fragile, thinking about what came next. The Accord had not disarmed humanity, it had distributed them. Esithka brought this to Vale Dorith at hour 16, sitting across from him in his office with the expression of someone who had just recalculated something and wished they hadn't. They knew about the cascade. No, Vale Dorith said, he was certain of this. This was not their plan. A resonance cascade in the Quelith system was not a contingency they arranged. Then, they planned for the category, not the event. He looked at his desk. They placed people throughout our infrastructure who were constitutionally incapable of being somewhere without understanding it, who would spend every day finding the gaps in what we'd built, not because they were ordered to, because that's how they're built. Esith Ka was quiet for a moment. Is that a military strategy? Vale Dorith considered the question carefully. I think it might be how they exist, he said. I think we asked them to disarm and they agreed and they meant it. I think they also could not stop being what they are, which is a species that looks at every room they're placed in and instinctively asks, what do we do if this breaks? Because it always has. Because it always has. Esith Ka turned to the window, the observation port that looked out into the dark where in 11 hours a cascade of low-frequency energy would wash through the station's systems like a tide through a sandcastle. They didn't threaten us, she said slowly. No, they never threatened us. No. We were afraid of what they were building, she paused. We should have been afraid of what they do when you take it away. The cascade hit at 3:47 station time. Kale was awake. She had not slept in 22 hours. She was sitting at the monitoring station she'd claimed for her own use, watching the readings from the backup system she'd built, eating something from a food pack she'd opened without looking at it, writing in the notebook. SFY, who was also awake, watched her from across the room. When the primary systems failed, a rolling cascade of failures that moved through Meridian 7 like a wave extinguishing systems that had run without interruption for decades, Kale did not react. She watched the readouts, made a single adjustment to the backup system, wrote something in the notebook, and then looked up and found SFY watching her. "We're okay," Kale said. "The splice I put in the atmospheric regulator junction is going to draw more power than I wanted, but the margin holds." "For how long?" Kale looked back at her readings. 6 months, maybe 7 if we're careful with the heating load in the outer residential rings. SFY looked at the dark screens around the room, the primary systems, the beautiful, efficient, perfectly designed systems that the Conclave had built and trusted and not questioned. "Why are you writing in that notebook?" SFY asked. "Now, what are you writing?" Kale looked down at the page. She was quiet for a moment in that particular human way, not evasive. SFY had learned to recognize the difference, but collecting something before speaking it. "When this is over," Kale said, "people are going to want to understand what worked and what didn't. They're going to want to rebuild, and they're going to want to rebuild better than before. And the things that worked, the things we put together in the last 20 hours, most of them broke every design principle your engineers have. They look wrong, they feel wrong, they work because of reasons that are really hard to articulate." She held up the notebook. "I'm writing it down so we don't forget. So when someone looks at what we built and says that's not how you're supposed to do it, we have a record of what that got us through." SFY stared at her. "You've done this before. Humans have done this before. A lot." Kale set the notebook down. "That's why we're still here." In the Conclave's emergency council chambers, the Cascade's aftermath was being assessed. 14 systems, 61 billion people. The numbers were enormous, and the potential casualties were real, and the work ahead was staggering. And in every single affected facility, the survival infrastructure, the systems holding the lights on and the air clean and the water moving, was running on something that had been built or repaired or conceptualized by a human who had been placed there 4 months ago by an ambassador who'd thought she looked relieved. Vale Dorith made his formal report to the council on the 3rd day after the cascade, and he began it with the clause the Accord had taken 11 months to negotiate, recognizing that humanity's military capability represents a destabilizing factor in the galactic order. He read it once. He looked at the assembled council. "I want to discuss," he said carefully, "what we were actually afraid of." The room waited. "We looked at their warships and their weapon platforms and their ground forces, and we saw military capability, and we decided that was the threat. We were not wrong that it was a threat." He paused. "We were wrong about what kind of threat." He put Kale's personnel file on the central display, then Dov's, then Priya's, then Marcus's, then the files of 200 other embedded humans, representing the fragment of 800 for which they had sufficient documentation to analyze. "The military capability was what they built to protect what they are. We stripped away what they built." He let that settle. "We did not change what they are." The silence in the chamber was the same quality as the silence he'd shared with Quell Varric, standing in front of decommissioning footage, trying to understand what they were looking at. "What are they?" someone asked. Vale Dorith had been thinking about this question for 4 months. He thought about a species that had climbed from subsistence to spaceflight while its own planet tried to kill it. He thought about a species that had developed medicine by understanding disease through suffering it. He thought about a species that had an intuition for fragility that no amount of abundance had yet erased, because the abundance was recent and the memory of loss was long. He thought about engineers who had memorized reconstruction sequences during the act of dismantling. He thought about a woman who kept a notebook. He thought about Marin Solis looking relieved, and he thought he finally understood the relief now, because Marin Solis had signed that document, had agreed genuinely, sincerely, without deception, and had looked relieved because she'd been afraid. Not of the Conclave, afraid of what humanity was carrying, afraid of the weight of being a young species with old weapons in a galaxy that didn't yet know you. And she had seen the Accord not as a defeat but as a chance to put the weapons down, to prove something, to be seen as something other than a threat. She had not known about the cascade. No one had. But she had known that weapons weren't actually the answer, that the thing keeping humanity safe was never the warships. It was the people inside them. They are, Veil Dorith said finally, a species that has fallen so many times that falling stopped frightening them. What frightens them is not falling. What frightens them is falling and not getting back up. He turned to the display, where 61 billion lives were being held together by backup systems built from old knowledge and improvised connections, and an instinct that no disarmament Accord touched. And in 400 years of cataloging the galaxy species, we never encountered one that had made that specific trade, that had bought their continuity with enough loss that loss itself became a tool. He thought about how to end, and he thought of the 7 words, and he thought of the word understand, and what it actually meant in the context of a species who had understood something the Conclave had not, that the galaxy was not stable, that consistency was not guaranteed, that every system that had never failed simply hadn't failed yet, and the question was not whether you could prevent failure but whether you could survive it. Humanity had not invented better weapons. Humanity had perfected the art of continuing. 3 weeks after the cascade, Kale received a letter from Dov. It was 2 pages, not 14. Near the end, in the compressed shorthand that now felt like a second language, he wrote, "They're asking questions we don't know how to answer without sounding like we planned it. I've been trying to explain that we didn't plan anything. We just couldn't stop looking." She wrote back the same day, and she wrote, "I know. I think that's what scares them. That it wasn't strategy. That we can't turn it off." She looked out the observation port at the dark, where the stars were old light from fires that had already died. She thought about Marin, who had looked relieved and been right to feel relief and been wrong about what the relief was for. She thought about her father, who had taught her to read the gaps in systems. She thought about every human who had ever stood in the ruins of something that used to work and started asking, "Okay, what now?" She opened the notebook to the last page she'd written and read what she'd put down at 3:47 station time while the Conclave's lights were going out. "We're okay." And then below it, without having been aware at the time of writing more, "We're always okay. Until we're not. And then we figure out what comes after that." She closed the notebook. Outside, across 14 systems, in stations and outposts and facilities that had been kept alive by old knowledge and paper letters, and the specific stubbornness of a species that had learned loss the hard way and never learned to be comfortable with it, 61 billion people breathed air that was still circulating. The stars did not know what they were looking at. That, Kale thought, was perhaps the most human thing of all. Not that the galaxy feared them. That the galaxy kept expecting them to stop, and could not yet understand that stopping was simply not a concept humanity had found a way to learn.